Now that we've seen a bird's eye view of the media, we're going to dive into two of the older, more traditional types of media, specifically print media like newspapers and the radio. What we're going to do in this video is a couple of things. First, we're going to talk about just how important the First Amendment is when it comes to all of these discussions. We're also going to be looking at some of the history of newspapers in America. Now, we're going to go way back in time and we're going to cover a lot in just a short period, but we're going to look at some of the highlights, and we're going to do that same thing for radio too. What were some of the ways that these types of media changed American democracy forever? So first, any discussion that we have about the media, we've always got to bring that back to the First Amendment. You're going to remember from our week on civil liberties, the First Amendment is so critical because it provides so many of the very foundation of liberty and freedom that we think about in our country. Things like the freedom to practice your own religion or to speak your mind freely without being worried that you're going to end up in a prison cell. Now, the First Amendment also says that Congress shall make no law that abridges the freedom of speech or the freedom of press. In other words, we have a lot of rights to say what we think and to actually write up what we think and to share them in the written form, to put them, in today's day, this would be like to talk about things and push that out on perhaps social media or online. We have the right under the First Amendment to do those things. And we can be very critical of the government if we wanted to. If you had an opinion that was unpopular, maybe you wanted to criticize the government, you can do that. In fact, people do that every single day in the United States. If you go to some other countries, maybe you want to go to China or North Korea or Iran, and you want to criticize the government and put that information out there in the public, you will most likely be facing some pretty significant challenges. A lot of countries around the world, they do not have the same kind of freedoms to be able to speak your mind and to be able to express yourself. So the media is protected in our country under the First Amendment, the rights to be able to say and to put ideas out there that might not be the ideas that the government likes. So it's all rooted in that First Amendment. We didn't always have a First Amendment. In fact, if you go back far enough, we didn't even have a constitution. If you go back far enough, we were just the 13 colonies. And so we're going to see the emergence of newspapers happen during the colonial era. In fact, back in 1704, in the city of Boston, you're going to see the very first newspaper established at that time. And it was influential. There were other ones that came up in Philadelphia and New York and around the colonies. They all had their own newspapers. But the purpose of the newspaper was really helpful in terms of spreading news. It was also very influential in terms of the Revolutionary War. It played that important role where newspapers were able to tell the colonists, these are all of the things that the British are doing that are really hurting us, that are hurting the colonists. Here are the reasons why we might even want to break from England. That kind of stuff was being reported in the newspapers. And you found at that time, the number of subscribers and the readers of these various newspaper publications were very high. This was the primary way that people would get their information. And we did see some attempts by the British to crack down on that. You're going to remember the Stamp Act from one of our early weeks in the class, where we were learning that the British was taxing paper goods, making it harder for people to be able to read the newspaper and do other stuff. Now, even past the Revolutionary War, the newspapers were incredibly important in terms of being able to allow for a public debate to happen. This is still a main role of the news media. And so you had Federalists who wanted the Constitution and anti-Federalists who said, hold it, we don't want to change. They were able to publish their own arguments in the newspapers and really try to engage in that debate in the public sphere. So obviously very important. Now, we're going to fast forward quite a bit, but let's look at another period in U.S. history where journalists were really kind of changing the game in terms of what journalism was all about. And that is during this period of time called the Progressive Era. So we've got this time period from the 1890s to the 1920s, and there was this type of journalism that emerged at that time called muckraking. And when I hear that term muckraking, I think of somebody digging through the mud. Okay, when you're digging through the mud, what are you doing? Well, you're kind of trying to unearth stuff. And what they're unearthing, what they're discovering is this corruption. Okay, so they're discovering, corrupt politicians and reporting about what they're doing. They're finding all of the ways that companies and corporations or maybe hurting the average person. So these muckraking journalists, they were exposing that corruption and exposing some of the bad stuff that was happening in society. By far, the most famous muckraking journalist of this time was a man named Upton Sinclair. Now, he was a journalist. He was also an avowed socialist. So he was trying to fight for socialism in the United States, which was a controversial thing at that time, especially in the 1920s. And so what he was doing was he actually wanted to shine a light on some of the poor labor practices that were happening in the city of Chicago. So what he did, he went undercover for 7 weeks. Nobody knew he was a journalist. He got a job at a meat packing plant. This is one of these facilities where they are butchering the cows, they're preparing the meat, they're getting it ready to send out. And he, in a series of newspaper articles that later became a book, he describes his experiences in the meatpacking industry. And he describes some really gross stuff. If you look at it, he talks about diseased cows that are coming through, and they're just grinding up the meat. Even though they know this cow has tuberculosis, they're grinding it up, they're sending it out for Americans to buy. He's talking about workers who are getting hurt on the lines. You know, they're getting severe injuries. And it's not like they could go just apply for unemployment insurance afterwards. People who are actually dying at work and their families left on the hook with no means of supporting themselves. So he wrote this investigative series that later went on to be called The Jungle. And it got so much attention that the government really changed and responded. This is where you see the introduction of the Food and Drug Administration. You've got government officials now going into the meat packing plants, making sure things look good, making sure things are inspected. If you ever go to the grocery store and you buy beef, you're going to say it's USDA inspected. And so you're going to have all of these laws that are kind of trying to regulate, meat production at that time. This is one example of somebody shining a light on corruption and being able to make a change from it. So that's a lasting legacy that Upton Sinclair has for his reporting. Now, newspapers used to be the king of media. That would be where Americans would go to get their media. Not so much anymore. And so why is that? Well, we've seen for really decades now, readership of traditional newspapers has been going down and down and down. And a big part of that is because there's just so much competition from TV and the internet. I bet you if you wanted to find the news story, you probably wouldn't run out to the corner gas station and buy a newspaper. You'd probably pull up your phone or your computer and just Google it. In addition to that, there are a lot of challenges for newspapers to raise enough money. Now, certainly they get money when you spend money on the newspaper, but one of their biggest sources was always selling classified ads. So the first time I ever bought a car, my dad took me down to the grocery store. We got a newspaper. We started looking through the back, and there would be all these people trying to sell their cars, and they'd post it in the newspaper. So we see this, old Honda Civic there, and hey, that looks like a good fit. There's a phone number. We call it up, and that's how I bought my car. Now, nobody does that anymore. Like, you don't really see that. If I want to sell a car now, I'll probably put it on Craigslist. Maybe you can go on OfferUp. You can go on Facebook Marketplace. There's all kinds of places online where you can post that. And it wasn't just buying and selling. You could also have people looking for a date. So you see the little image here, and you see that this guy's looking for, SJM. I assume that's single Jewish male, 41, seeking SF, single female. Looks not important. Must be tall, slim, and attractive. It's kind of funny. He says looks not important, but I guess maybe they are for him, right? So people used to do this too. Like if you want to find a date, maybe you'd put in a classified ad and you'd try to find somebody. Now, of course, we have different websites and different apps where you can try to find a date. Most people aren't going to the classified ads to do that. The newspapers are losing a lot of money because traditionally you would pay them to actually run one of these ads. That doesn't happen quite so much anymore. So what's the effect of this? Well, they have less money, so they make fewer profits, so they hire fewer journalists, and ultimately there are fewer newspapers. You see a lot fewer local public newspapers anymore that are reporting on local stories. So that's one of the downsides of the newspaper industry kind of losing out on the competition to TV and to the internet. So the next major source of news and information, media, is going to be the radio. And radio really came in a big way in the 1920s in the United States. At this time, one of the major things that changed was you didn't have to live near a big town or a city with a newspaper anymore. You could live way out in the countryside, and as long as you had electricity, You could turn on that radio and you could hear stuff broadcast from hundreds of miles away. So that was a new technology that was coming online in the 1920s. And the president that we really associate most with the radio is going to be the guy that you see here, and that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, he came into office in the early 1930s, and within just 8 days of taking office, he was sitting down on the radio and broadcasting a message into the home of every American. And this gave him a lot of power. No other previous president had had the ability to really talk directly to the American people. So he did this regularly, over 30 times, I believe, throughout his presidency, where he would have just a discussion with the American public. He would talk about things like the American involvement in World War II or the Great Depression, and they came to be known as fireside chats. The reason they're called that is because it felt very intimate. It felt like you're sitting in your living room listening to the radio, and it's almost like you're having just a chat with somebody face to face. So it's a direct way the president being able to communicate with the American people. If you were around at that time in the 1940s, you might have heard this part. I'm going to give you about 40 seconds worth of a fireside chat, and you can really hear sort of what Americans would have heard around that time.
No pessimistic policy about the future of America shall delay the immediate expansion of those industries essential to defense. We need them. I want to make it clear that it is the purpose of the nation to build now with all possible speed every machine, every arsenal, every factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will.
So there you have Franklin Roosevelt talking directly to the American people about what was going to be needed in terms of sacrifice for World War II. Now, speaking of World War II, that's actually a time when radio is going to get a big leg up competition-wise over newspapers. If you want updates in the newspapers, you have to wait every day. It just comes out once a day. With the radio, Americans could get hourly updates. What was happening with the war, what was happening around the world, and what were our decision makers saying and doing. So you could really get that breaking news. So that was a really big thing and a really big advantage for radio. Now, radio is still important to this day. So even up until today, most of the time, the reason that people want to listen to the radio has to do with music. But radio also still provides that platform for learning about politics. You could listen to the news, or you could even be listening to a morning radio station and still getting information about what's happening. So the images that you see here are from back in 2020. Some of you are going to recognize some of the people in this picture. You see Kamala Harris there and Bernie Sanders. Now, all of the people that you see here are running for president, and they're all being interviewed by Charlemagne the God. Now, some of you are going to know Charlemagne from his work in New York City. He's a radio host of a really popular morning radio show called The Breakfast Club. And so in 2020, he had all of the Democratic candidates, all these people who wanted to be president, to really come on and ask them questions. What are you going to do if you're president? And he asked some really actually hard-hitting questions to some of the candidates. He really made news around this time. And so it's just a reminder that even though we kind of think of radio as being sort of an older kind of technology, the same thing, it still has an enormous reach. A lot of people listen to it, and politicians can try to access the airwaves to reach Americans directly. Now, that's going to do it for our discussion on print media and on the radio. When we come back next time, what we're going to be exploring is all about television, which is something that I think most of us have a lot more experience with. I'll see you at the next one.